Some killers wear ski masks, others wear wedding rings, but the most terrifying ones tuck their children into bed before slaughtering them. These aren't monsters that hide in forests or alleyways. They're the ones who smile in photographs, wave to the neighbors, and pour milk into cereal bowls hours before turning a home into a graveyard. What makes these cases unforgettable isn't just the scale of the violence. It's the illusion that everything was normal right until the moment it wasn't. And when the truth finally surfaces, it doesn't come from a confession. It comes from bloodstains on floorboards, missing prescription bottles, and a final receipt from a gas station hundreds of miles from where the house used to stand. The first killer didn't look like a threat. He was a dentist, respected in his community, a father of 3, and by every outward measure, an image of suburban calm. But behind closed doors, Andrew Delmar was collapsing. Financial pressure, malpractice accusations, and a looming divorce had fractured the carefully groomed life he projected. By early spring, Andrew had begun liquidating assets quietly, selling his wife's jewelry under aliases, transferring money into offshore accounts, and building a private storage unit that investigators later described as a surgical command post. On the night of April 9th, he arrived home early from work with no warning, bypassed the kitchen, and walked directly to the breaker box. The security system went dead. From there, he retrieved a military-grade sedative he had illegally ordered online, a paralytic used for large animal euthanasia, and mixed it into homemade smoothies for his children. He served them one by one in the living room while his wife, unaware, was upstairs in the bath. Within 18 minutes, all 3 children were unconscious. He then suffocated each of them with a compression bag used in dental anesthesia. The medical precision of the murders left almost no visible trauma. Upstairs, he waited outside the bathroom for his wife to finish her bath. When she opened the door, he struck her with a blunt force dental mallet, not to kill, but to stun. She collapsed, and he dragged her to the garage where he had prepared a sterile enclosure lined with plastic sheeting. Using a tourniquet and an electric bone saw, he dismembered her body into sections later found vacuum-sealed inside sterilization pouches. In his storage unit, police discovered exact diagrams of the human circulatory system marked with preferred zones of silence, areas he believed would bleed less and reveal fewer forensic clues. He placed the children's bodies inside hollow compartments of his SUV's rear wall panels, sealed the vehicle shut, and abandoned it in a long-term airport parking garage with the keys left under the seat. The only reason the case broke open was because Andrew missed a crucial detail: flight manifests. His one-way plane ticket to Alaska was flagged after a coworker noticed his sudden absence and reported a series of goodbye emails he had sent from a burner account. Surveillance footage from the airport restroom showed him shaving his beard and changing into a pre-purchased park ranger uniform. When federal agents tracked him through hotel receipts and vehicle rentals, they found him attempting to cross into Canada on foot, dressed in winter gear and carrying forged wildlife credentials. Upon arrest, he refused to answer questions, instead repeating, "They're safe now," in a calm voice. During the trial, prosecutors revealed that Andrew had built a replica of his living room inside his storage unit to rehearse the timing of each murder. The jury returned a guilty verdict on all 4 counts of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to life without parole. In prison, he became known for his silence, never engaging in conversation, never expressing remorse. Guards reported finding him standing for hours, motionless, staring at a blank wall. No one visits him. His dental license was revoked, his house was demolished, and the only thing left on the property is a rusted swing set no one dares touch. It wasn't the stench that led investigators to the house. It was the silence. For 3 full days after Andrew Delmar disappeared, no one entered the property. The mail stacked on the porch, the family car still in the driveway, and the absence of movement behind drawn blinds all fed a growing unease among neighbors. But it wasn't until a close colleague of Andrew's reported a cryptic final voicemail, a monotone message simply stating, "It's done. I won't be back." That police were finally sent to conduct a wellness check. What they found inside was a stillness so unnatural it disturbed even seasoned homicide detectives. The home was spotless, no signs of forced entry. The children's rooms were perfectly arranged, their beds made, their toys in place. It was only when an officer opened the refrigerator and noticed an unusually large amount of pre-prepared smoothies, half empty, identical in container and flavor, that suspicion crept in. Forensics later determined that each smoothie contained lethal doses of paralytic agents. Upstairs, in the master bathroom, water was still pooled along the tub's edge, a dried splash pattern along the tile suggesting a struggle. In the garage, police discovered 2 large industrial coolers, both clean but stained faintly red beneath UV light. That's when they began expanding their search beyond the home. Airport parking records, flagged from the previous week, turned up Andrew's SUV. K9 units were dispatched. What they found inside was horrifying. The bodies of the 3 children were hidden behind removable paneling in the rear cargo walls, wrapped tightly in plastic and scented dryer sheets, a tactic used to mask decomposition from detection dogs. The wife's body, however, was missing until they traced Andrew's known purchases to a rented storage unit in a neighboring county. That unit, when opened, revealed a scene that prosecutors would later describe as more disturbing than any death chamber. The replica living room was lit by soft, ambient bulbs, complete with furniture, toys, and framed family photos. Hidden compartments held surgical tools, dental-grade disinfectants, and a digital timer labeled "Simulate Bedtime Routine." Along the far wall, dozens of laminated sheets were pinned in sequential order, each one documenting anatomical details, angles of approach, and handwritten notes like "no hesitation" and "press until still." One item stood out among them, a sealed envelope addressed to God, inside of which Andrew had written, "They deserved silence more than suffering." In court, the prosecution presented a clinical, disturbing narrative. They argued that Andrew viewed his family not as victims, but as problems to be managed. Evidence being his precise use of sedation, the lack of bruising, and the ritualistic cleanliness of the aftermath. The jury was shown digital renderings of the storage unit and 3D reconstructions of the murder timeline, based on timestamps from smart home logs and a hidden journal app on Andrew's phone. One of the most haunting pieces of evidence came from his laptop, a folder titled "Exit Strategy," which included contingency plans for identity changes, alternate disguises, and fake professions he could adopt in remote regions. Psychologists testified that Andrew fit the profile of a compartmentalized narcissist with clinical dissociation, meaning he had the emotional capability to treat each murder as an isolated task devoid of human meaning. But the defense attempted a different approach, arguing that Andrew had suffered a psychotic break, triggered by financial stress and a cocktail of anti-anxiety medications. The jury rejected that defense in less than 3 hours. When the verdict was read, guilty on all counts of premeditated murder, Andrew stood motionless, eyes locked forward, showing no sign of acknowledgement. He was sentenced to 4 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. But the story didn't end there. A year after his conviction, new inmates reported that Andrew began exhibiting strange behaviors in solitary confinement. He refused to speak. He stopped eating unless meals were served at the exact same time each day. He began tearing pages from library books, not to destroy them, but to recreate the layout of his old storage unit on the floor of his cell, using paper instead of walls, shadows instead of lights. Correctional officers, disturbed by his behavior, requested psychological evaluations, but Andrew refused to participate. To this day, he remains in isolation, labeled a high-risk inmate. The house was eventually sold, then demolished after the new owners discovered claw marks beneath the basement carpet, assumed to be from the wife's final moments before being dragged. Neighbors never speak of it. The case files were sealed after the trial. But every so often, journalists try to dig them up again, hoping to understand how a father could turn a home into a morgue without leaving a single scream behind. But Andrew Delmar wasn't the only man who wore fatherhood like a mask while planning his family's extermination. 1,000 miles east, behind another picket fence and another suburban smile, another monster had already begun measuring his home like a spreadsheet, and every person inside it like a liability waiting to be zeroed out. Thomas Griggs was the kind of man who believed in order above affection. His yard was immaculate, his wardrobe sterile, his voice always calm, like a machine reading a rule book no one else could see. He lived in a pristine Connecticut colonial with his wife Elena and their 2 teenage sons, Nathan and Caleb. To the outside world, they were painfully normal. A tidy, quiet family with matching Christmas sweaters and no gossip to speak of. But behind that controlled silence was a suffocating structure. Thomas micromanaged everything from pantry inventory to shower times, assigning rotating schedules for each family member and issuing subtle punishments when his standards weren't met. His work-from-home transition during the pandemic pushed that control into obsession. He logged behavioral data on his children, gave Elena passive-aggressive checklists, and developed what he privately called his reset plan, a series of Excel sheets outlining disciplinary procedures for infractions as small as spilled cereal or late replies. The more the world outside spiraled, the more Thomas tightened the grip on his world within. And somewhere along the line, his fantasies about obedience turned into calculations about erasure. According to recovered notes, he believed emotional entropy had corrupted the household, and that removal was the only viable fix. What followed wasn't rage or panic, it was logistics. On a quiet Thursday evening in October, Thomas carried out the murders like he was closing a portfolio. He began with his sons, blending fast-acting muscle relaxants into their protein shakes after basketball practice, served with robotic encouragement about their strong discipline. Within 20 minutes, both boys were paralyzed and drifting. He gently moved them to the basement futon and injected them with a second compound, targeting their central nervous systems. When the autopsy came, even the coroner was stunned by the precision. There were no bruises, no trauma, only chemical fingerprints and cardiac collapse. Elena was next. She returned from grocery shopping to find dinner waiting, the table neatly set, candles lit. Thomas handed her a glass of red wine, already laced, and asked her to sit down. She barely finished half before her vision blurred. Thomas, methodical as ever, guided her to the upstairs bed and wrapped her body in an embroidered comforter. He positioned her hands in prayer. Then he turned off the lights in each room, one by one, and opened every window in the house. A symbolic gesture he'd scribbled in a spiral notebook later found in the safe. Let the air erase what the voices left behind. He dressed the boys in matching pajamas and laid them side by side in their childhood beds. The dog, a golden retriever named Samson, was strangled in the garage and wrapped in a towel embroidered with the family crest. Thomas then mopped the floors, deleted his emails, packed a single gym bag, and drove to a rented storage unit an hour away. There, in a dim steel locker, he hanged himself using a resistance band and a steel hook embedded into a ceiling beam, installed by Thomas himself weeks prior, under a fake maintenance request. A cleaning crew discovered him 2 days later. The police connected the address, performed a welfare check, and found the house in perfect silence. No struggle, no alarms. Just a digital metronome ticking on the kitchen island, a pot of cold stew still on the stove, and the entire Griggs family laid out like museum exhibits of peace. But nothing about it was peaceful. The court had no defendant, only files, formulas, and notebooks that treated life like a malfunctioning system. Thomas Griggs never screamed. He never broke. He just ended the people who loved him most, because in his mind, they were already broken beyond repair. The crime scene investigators entered the Griggs home expecting disarray. Instead, they walked into silence wrapped in symmetry. Every chair pushed in, every dish rinsed, every light bulb replaced. But it was the smell that stopped them first, not of death, but lavender disinfectant, the scent of someone who wanted to be remembered as clean. Upstairs, Elena lay beneath a comforter with her hands folded precisely over her chest. No defensive wounds, no contusions. Toxicology would later confirm 2 sedatives and a mild paralytic in her system, administered in precisely timed doses. The boys, found in matching beds, were equally unmarked. Their stomach contents showed timed ingestion, suggesting Thomas had modeled the kills down to the minute. Even the dog's body had been handled with ritualistic precision, cleaned, combed, placed away from view. Forensics teams quickly realized they weren't looking at an explosion of violence. They were looking at a man who'd mapped an entire multi-victim homicide like an engineering flowchart. In Thomas's home office, detectives recovered 47 printed spreadsheets, 19 handwritten logs, and a series of laminated blueprints labeled FAMRESET. These weren't rage-fueled scribbles. They were project management plans. One log listed potential obstacles to execution, such as neighbor surveillance and inconsistent ingestion times. Another assessed drug dosages per body weight, side effects, and timelines for symptom onset. It was as if he'd turned his family into a set of problem statements. In his private safe, they found an encrypted flash drive titled Final Audit. Once cracked, it contained a 29-slide PowerPoint detailing what he called emotional decay metrics, graphs tracking his perceived deterioration of obedience from each family member. His son Caleb was ranked highest in recidivist behaviors. His wife Elena had a score of 74 in resistance escalation. Even more disturbing, these charts dated back 5 years. He had been logging their personalities, failings, and infractions like a behavioral economist measuring market volatility. Investigators realized this was never about a single breaking point. It was about a long, cold march toward premeditated subtraction. Public reaction to the Griggs case was stunned silence. No social media history of violence, no criminal record, no warning signs. But to those who worked the case, the truth was far more terrifying. Thomas Griggs didn't kill out of hatred. He killed because he thought his family had become inefficient. Local media dubbed him the system purger. National outlets ran headlines calling it the most orderly family massacre in modern memory. Psychiatric analysts were brought in to study the files and returned with terms like pathological reductionism and calculative delusional disorder. But even those labels felt inadequate. Thomas hadn't snapped. He hadn't screamed. He hadn't fought. He had simply removed the people he was meant to love like corrupted code from a machine. In court, there was no trial. Thomas was already dead, discovered in a self-manufactured noose in a storage unit designed with the same care he gave to spreadsheets. But prosecutors still presented the evidence, out of respect for the victims, and to give the community closure. They showed graphs, lists, handwritten notes that ranked family members by repairability. One slide even calculated the time it would take for the bodies to be discovered, based on neighborhood trash schedules and grocery routines. It was precise, it was horrifying, and it was unlike anything the courtroom had seen. At the memorial, neighbors left candles but no words. No one knew what to say about a man who wore khakis, smiled at cookouts, and quietly prepared to euthanize his family like a malfunctioning program. Even now, years later, the name Thomas Griggs remains largely unknown outside law enforcement circles. But inside the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit, his case is used as a textbook example of the most chilling kind of family killer. Not the furious, not the desperate, but the unshakably logical, the kind who doesn't see blood, only data. If Thomas Griggs showed how dangerous cold logic could be inside a household, then the next case showed what happened when delusion and desperation fused into something equally calculated, but far less predictable. In the spring of 2012, a quiet Midwestern town met its most unthinkable killer. Jordan Voss, a former youth pastor turned financial consultant who believed God had given him one last mission. Unlike Griggs, who built spreadsheets in the dark, Jordan preached weekly sermons on purpose and love. He baptized babies, led neighborhood cleanup projects, donated winter coats, but all the while, he believed his family was an anchor dragging him from a divine calling. His wife, Megan, was a schoolteacher, bright, selfless, and admired. Their 2 children, ages 10 and 12, were homeschooled by Megan in a house adorned with scripture and science posters. But behind the scenes, Jordan's private journal was growing darker. He believed the world was entering a divine reset phase, and that only total detachment from earthly ties would cleanse the soul. It started with canceled appointments, then disappearing money, then whispering to himself during sermons. When the church board confronted him about erratic behavior and missing funds, Jordan resigned abruptly and retreated into isolation. For 6 weeks, no one saw him. Not at grocery stores, not walking the dog, not at Sunday service. And then one morning, he walked into a police station and placed a single key on the desk. "They're all clean now," he whispered. The house was locked, every window covered, every surface scrubbed with bleach. Inside, police found Megan in the master bedroom, wrapped in white linen, her hands marked with a faint chemical burn that would later be linked to a failed self-defense struggle. The children were in their beds, side by side, both appearing asleep, but forensic imaging revealed puncture wounds beneath the hairline, each exactly 1 inch deep, spaced precisely. A titanium awl, a woodworking tool, was recovered from the laundry sink, cleaned and stored like nothing had happened. Investigators noted that every light bulb in the home had been removed and replaced with LED lanterns, all set to the dimmest setting, pointed toward the floor. In a notebook recovered from Jordan's closet, he'd written, "Artificial light is distortion. They'll go in stillness." Police also discovered that he'd disconnected the main breaker and burned all family photos in the backyard fire pit days before the murders. But what chilled them most was a final page, titled simply, "3 Perfect Departures." Under it, 3 bullet points. No screams, no mistakes, no return. Jordan's confession was emotionless. He claimed he'd fasted for 7 days, walked the perimeter of his property barefoot, and read the entire book of Revelation out loud the night before. Then, one by one, he gave his family melatonin-laced tea and waited. The kills came hours apart. Megan fought. The children didn't. In his mind, he believed he was purifying them, sending them up without burden. The coroner later confirmed that all 3 had died within a 12-hour window, but not simultaneously. Jordan sat with the bodies for 2 days, playing hymns on a loop and writing what he called departure journals, spiritual eulogies for each family member, filled with warped theology, strange metaphors, and references to astral gates. During his trial, Jordan showed no emotion. He requested no lawyer. He represented himself and called no witnesses. His defense, if it could be called that, consisted of reading selected Bible passages and insisting he had completed the mission. The courtroom remained mostly silent, except when Megan's parents wept during the forensic slideshow. The prosecutor's case was built entirely on physical evidence, the tool marks, the chemicals, the writings, but no motive that made sense by legal standards. And that's what made it so disturbing. There was no rage, no feud, no financial motive, just a father who believed, with absolute conviction, that killing his family was obedience. The jury took less than 2 hours to return a verdict. Guilty on all counts. Jordan Voss now serves 3 consecutive life sentences in a maximum security facility where he reportedly refuses to speak and has spent over a year in voluntary isolation. Psychiatrists who reviewed the case still debate what exactly broke inside him. Was it schizophrenia cloaked in religious delusion? Was it a psychotic break from mounting pressure? Or was it something far more dangerous? The weaponization of belief against those closest to him. To this day, the Voss home remains empty, unsold, the windows still covered. No one has touched the lanterns. No one wants to. After the guilty verdict was read, Jordan Voss remained motionless in the courtroom, his hands folded, his gaze fixed on the floor beneath his seat. The room, silent, but for the hum of ventilation and the occasional stifled sob, bore witness to a man so emotionally detached that even seasoned court officers remarked they had never seen eyes that empty. He made no appeal. He asked for no leniency. Instead, he submitted a handwritten note to the court clerk that read simply, "3 gates closed. No regrets." The judge, after reviewing both the forensic evidence and the psychological reports submitted by state-appointed experts, imposed the harshest sentencing available. 3 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole, to be served in solitary confinement due to what the warden later described as an unpredictable and symbolic behavioral profile. What that meant, in real terms, was that Jordan Voss had displayed such a ritualistic approach to his crimes, from the staging of the bodies to the use of religious iconography, including salt circles and hand-drawn crosses on mirrors, that prison psychologists deemed him a risk to himself and others, not due to violent outbursts, but due to his calm willingness to act on symbolic beliefs. The aftermath in the small Indiana town was no less haunting. The Voss residence remained sealed for weeks while forensic teams completed their sweep. Inside the home, they discovered the walls had been methodically stripped of family photos, every memory card removed from cameras and computers, every trace of the family's digital life wiped clean. On one bedroom wall, etched faintly beneath layers of primer, was the phrase, "To leave the flesh, leave the name." Analysts interpreted it as a deliberate effort by Jordan to erase identity as a precursor to his so-called purification. Even the family dog had been given away to a neighbor days before the murder, as if Jordan had known the exact hour when he would no longer allow love, sound, or interruption inside the home. Megan's teaching journals, recovered from a basement filing cabinet, painted a chilling contrast. They spoke of future science fair projects, family camping plans, and handwritten birthday ideas. All the while, Jordan had been building a mental architecture designed not just to kill, but to frame those deaths as sacred acts. One expert witness in court referred to his mindset as detached spiritual psychopathy, a form of narcissistic delusion that masks itself in theology, enabling atrocity while the perpetrator believes they're performing salvation. In prison, Jordan Voss does not speak. He refused all visitors, even clergy. He eats in silence, avoids eye contact, and spends his days pacing in small, controlled movements. Surveillance footage shows him sometimes miming writing in the air, as if still composing sermons or divine instructions. One guard said he often mouths the same sentence over and over, "I made them eternal." There is no confirmed diagnosis, no medication, no psychiatric treatment plan, because Jordan has never accepted any evaluation. He does not see himself as sick. He sees himself as finished. The community, meanwhile, has never recovered. The local church where Jordan once preached remains abandoned, its marquee still blank, its doors locked with police tape weathered by years of sun and snow. Neighbors refuse to speak publicly about the case. Megan's sister moved out of state. The elementary school where Megan taught established a memorial scholarship in her name, but the funding dried up after parents pulled their children from the district en masse, unable to walk past the old Voss house without remembering what happened inside. The home still stands, unsold, windows boarded, lanterns left exactly where Jordan placed them. Occasionally, teenagers dare each other to approach it, but no one goes in. Some say the lights flicker at night. Others claim the air around the property feels colder. The house has become a physical wound, the last footprint of a killer who believed the path to God required blood, silence, and mathematical precision. But what makes Jordan Voss unforgettable is not just what he did, it's how invisible it all seemed until it was over. He smiled at neighbors, He quoted scripture. He planned a garage sale the week before. And yet, behind that composure was a blueprint of death so detailed, so quietly executed, that no one realized they were standing next to a man preparing his own household for ritual extinction. And perhaps that's what makes his case one of the most disturbing in recent memory. Not the violence itself, but the calm with which it unfolded, and the utter absence of remorse from a man who believed, down to his last breath as a free man, that murder was not betrayal, but obedience. Some killers leave behind questions, others leave behind echoes. But in the case of Jordan Voss, what he left was a silence so heavy it clung to the wallpaper. Yet even that stillness, even that eerie blueprint of faith and murder, would be dwarfed by what came next. A case so clean, so surgically executed, that even seasoned detectives began to doubt their own instincts. Because the next man on this list didn't just erase a family. He erased the concept of a family, rewriting it into something transactional, something procedural. His name was Elliot Crane, a former biotech engineer from Stamford, Connecticut, and on the surface, he was every inch the American success story. Ivy League degree, 3 published patents, a stable marriage to a pediatric nurse named Dana, and 2 sons, Tyler and Caleb, both under the age of 10. Neighbors described the Cranes as robotically functional, polite but private, like a family operating by instruction manual. And that manual, it turned out, had been authored by Elliot. He lived by a system, not a belief, not a philosophy, but a literal algorithmic framework of decision trees he'd written himself. It governed everything: finances, bedtime routines, date nights, arguments, even apologies. Dana, his wife, had once joked during a BBQ that Elliot scheduled sex like a data pipeline. But the laughter stopped on the morning of June 12, 2021, when police were called to the Crane residence by a neighbor who spotted broken glass near the garage and a strange chemical odor in the air. What they found inside was not a murder scene. It was a shutdown protocol. Every room had been cleaned, all personal photos removed, furniture wrapped in plastic. The refrigerator emptied. All devices, phones, tablets, laptops, had been factory reset, and the family car had been wiped of fingerprints. In the living room, 3 plastic-wrapped body bags were neatly lined up against the far wall, sealed with color-coded duct tape. Each bore a laminated tag: Dana, complete; Tyler, complete; Caleb, complete. Elliot's body wasn't among them, but his laptop was. And on it, a chilling document titled Endgame_4.7 explained, in painfully calm detail, why the operation had been executed. It wasn't passion, it wasn't rage, it was inefficiency. Dana had begun resisting the system, deviating from her task flows, introducing unpredictable emotional spikes. Tyler had been flagged for non-compliance in structured learning, and Caleb had shown poor optimization in morning routines. The document continued, "I have restructured this node of human integration to prevent systemic collapse. Core units terminated. Contingency protocol engaged." That contingency protocol, as it turned out, was Elliot's disappearance. Security footage captured him leaving the house at 3:13 a.m., dressed in a dark windbreaker and slacks, carrying a single briefcase. He boarded a train to New York City. That was the last confirmed sighting. The forensics team was dumbfounded. There were no signs of struggle. Toxicology reports revealed trace amounts of a custom neuromuscular inhibitor in all 3 victims, likely administered in juice boxes and tea. It caused full-body paralysis within minutes but left the heart functioning, prolonging awareness. The medical examiner estimated that Dana and the children were conscious for up to 15 minutes before asphyxiation, suffocating under the plastic wrap while unable to move or scream. Elliot had even designed the room to remain soundproof and temperature-controlled to avoid disturbing the timeline. But what pushed this case into the realm of the horrifying wasn't just the method. It was the mindset. Elliot had documented the entire process like a clinical trial, noting response curves, emotional baselines, and termination latency. He'd even set up a GoPro system that captured data overlays on the footage: heart rate, vocal levels, oxygen consumption. The footage was deleted, but the metadata remained. In court, the FBI's behavioral unit labeled Elliot a controlled annihilator, someone who doesn't kill for pleasure or rage, but to solve a problem with total emotional detachment. His trial never happened because Elliot Crane was never caught. To this day, the FBI believes he may have fled the country using forged biometric profiles, having spent years preparing exit protocols stored across offshore servers. Cryptic notes found in a locker in Newark suggest he'd built backup identities and even modeled simulations of how long it would take investigators to trace him. His final logged entry, time-stamped 2 hours before the murders, read, "System reboot scheduled. No legacy errors permitted." The Crane home was condemned. No one has purchased the property. Journalists who've entered illegally describe it as eerily pristine, the walls still scrubbed, the floors still bare, like someone pressed delete on a family. Neighbors moved away. The school removed the boys' photos from yearbooks. Dana's hospital held a candlelight vigil, but even that faded in time. And Elliot? If he's still alive, he's likely living under a name that wasn't even invented yet. A ghost in the machine he once called life. But what makes his case so chilling isn't just the planning. It's the fact that to Elliot, the act of murder was just a function call. And his family? Just outdated code that needed to be purged for optimal system health. The most terrifying part about Elliot Crane wasn't the murder itself, it was what came after. Because unlike so many other killers who leave behind a signature, a scar, or at least a trail of panic, Elliot left behind something much worse: a vacuum. The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit, tasked with compiling a predictive model of his next move, was divided from the start. Half believed he had vanished into urban anonymity, possibly embedding himself in a major tech firm or data consulting role under a new identity. The other half believed he was already dead, having followed the final line of his Endgame_4.7 document. Completion must equal disappearance. Legacy cannot contaminate future variables. But regardless of which theory held weight, the investigation into Elliot's next steps quickly revealed just how much he had planned. At the heart of it all was his obsession with systems. He had always been more loyal to architecture than people. That obsession became a wall, blocking investigators at every turn. All of his financial accounts had been closed a week before the murder. His social media activity had been wiped clean, and the metadata from his emails showed scheduled delays and embedded trackers that rerouted through servers in Iceland, Singapore, and Estonia. But the most haunting piece of evidence came not from the digital world, but from a storage unit in Hoboken, discovered 7 months after the killings. Inside were 10 large banker boxes filled with printouts, blueprints of hypothetical lives, different names, different job roles, projected friendships, detailed analyses of human behavior in regional dialects, likely success rates for blending into different socio-economic groups. Each scenario came with a failure tree, outlining how to exit the identity if suspicion arose. Elliot hadn't just planned one escape, he had rehearsed 30. The boxes also contained original photos, not just family portraits, but manipulated versions showing Elliot in fabricated scenes, fishing with an invented cousin in Oregon, celebrating a wedding with a photoshopped spouse in London, teaching a workshop in Berlin. And yet, not a single witness anywhere had ever seen him since that night. The U.S. Marshals Service placed him on their top 15 list in late 2022, citing him as one of the most uniquely equipped fugitives in American history. But that designation also revealed something deeply unsettling. Elliot's complete rejection of identity wasn't a mask. It was his belief system. One box, labeled post-human integration included pages of handwritten notes theorizing that attachment, tradition, even morality were byproducts of inefficient social contracts. Emotion slows process, he wrote. Legacy corrupts clarity. Another page simply read, "What is more ethical, suffering within chaos or terminating the equation?" Cyberpsychologists began publishing papers about Elliott syndrome, describing a new breed of killer that doesn't kill out of impulse or pathology, but from a belief in optimizing existence. For many in law enforcement, this wasn't just a manhunt. It was a philosophical battle, one that so far the killer was winning. The Crane murders also triggered something else, a wave of paranoid mimicry. In California, a software developer poisoned his family using Elliott's published patent formulas. In Florida, a man tried to erase his own digital footprint using a modified Crane wipe script found on dark web forums. Suddenly, the very system designed to catch Elliott was feeding off the ideology he left behind. Even courtroom experts found themselves unable to close the file. During a congressional subcommittee hearing on fugitive cybercriminals, one analyst famously said, "Elliott Crane didn't just vanish. He proved that a person can live outside the map." As of now, there have been over 150 leads, 12 international task force reviews, and 6 misidentifications. Every time a man of Elliott's height and build passes through customs without a trace, it triggers a temporary flag in FBI systems. But each one ends the same way, inconclusive. What haunts the agents most is the apartment footage, that 3:13 a.m. exit where Elliott calmly checks his watch, closes the door, and walks into the night without a backward glance. As if murder was just the final step in a project he'd completed perfectly. To this day, his home remains unsold. Dana's family tried to file a wrongful death suit, but the estate had been drained and restructured through offshore proxies. The boys' old school created a memorial plaque, but it was stolen 3 days after installation. What remains, ultimately, is a single question. What happens when a killer doesn't think of himself as a killer at all? When the act of wiping out his family is seen not as a tragedy, but as a software update? The Crane case may never be solved, but even in his absence, Elliott's presence lingers. In every unexplained disappearance, every glitch in the digital matrix of human identity, every time someone looks at their reflection and wonders if the person behind the glass could someday choose to erase the world and walk away, just because the equation didn't balance anymore. Some disappear behind code, others behind charm, but the last killer didn't vanish at all. He sat quietly among the wreckage he created, sipping orange juice at the breakfast table while 5 bodies decomposed in the walls beneath him. Compared to Elliott Crane's surgical erasure, Matthew Greer's brand of murder was grotesquely analog. There were no algorithms, no clean exits, no philosophical manifestos, just a ranch-style home in Michigan, a hammer, a nail gun, and the belief that the only way to fix a broken family was to turn it into furniture. Matthew wasn't the type of man who drew suspicion. He wasn't a recluse or a tech savant. He worked at a used appliance store, had a membership at the local bowling alley, and hosted church BBQs with smoked ribs and apple pie. He had a wife named Kendra, 2 teenage sons, and a mother-in-law who lived with them part-time. His neighbors described him as a little quiet but polite, which is often the last thing people say before the headlines roll out. But the cracks had been forming for years. Financially, Matthew was underwater. His credit cards were maxed. The store had been cutting hours. And Kendra had begun taking night shifts at a nearby diner just to keep the electricity on. At some point, survival turned into bitterness, and bitterness turned into calculation. The police timeline, reconstructed painstakingly from bank statements, heat signatures, and the faint scribbles in Matthew's garage notebook, showed that he had been planning for 5 weeks. Not in a meticulous crane-style schematic, but in a raw, handwritten checklist that read, get tarp, cement, nails, silence. The first to die was Kendra. Autopsy records noted blunt force trauma to the back of the head, consistent with a claw hammer. Investigators believe she was attacked in the garage while loading laundry. The sons, Nathan, 17, and Eli, 15, were likely killed next, both in their sleep. Blood spatter patterns on the bedroom ceiling suggested minimal struggle, and their mattresses had been turned before the bodies were removed. The mother-in-law, Diane, was last. According to the medical examiner, she showed defensive wounds, fractured wrists, bruising on the forearm, bite marks on her own tongue. She fought. It didn't matter. All four were wrapped in plastic, sealed in makeshift plywood boxes, and buried in a crawl space Matthew had quietly extended weeks prior. But what happened next was even more disturbing. He didn't run. Didn't fake a disappearance or torch the house. Instead, he began replacing the family in public. He dropped off his wife's work uniform at the diner and claimed she had taken a weekend job in Ohio. He told the boys' school they had switched to homeschooling due to bullying concerns. When Diane's bridge club called, he answered in a falsetto and said she had a cough, and for a while, bizarrely, it worked. Nobody looked too hard. Not until a pest control crew called in for a termite problem, opened the crawl space, and nearly passed out from the stench. That's when the horror peeled back. The police arrived on a Thursday. Body cams captured the moment they stepped into the crawl space. 4 wooden boxes, each sealed with industrial-grade nails and stenciled with numbers. 1, 2, 3, 4. Matthew sat in the living room, watching golf, remote in hand. When they asked where his family was, he answered, "Under there, I think." No emotion, no resistance, just a man whose equation had reached its conclusion. What followed in court was a spectacle soaked in contradiction. The defense pleaded temporary psychosis. The prosecution argued long-term intent. But the most haunting piece of evidence came from the garage notebook, where a final page contained only one sentence. "They stopped being real the moment I stopped being able to fix them." Clinical psychologists debated whether it was a delusional break or a pragmatic justification. The jury took 2 hours. Guilty on all counts. 4 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. Yet what lingered wasn't the verdict. It was the fact that for almost 6 weeks, a man had eaten, slept, and shaved above the very people he had murdered, believing perhaps that if he moved slow enough, the world would forget to ask where they'd gone. Matthew's house has since been condemned. The appliance store shuttered. The church held a memorial with empty coffins. But every now and then, a neighbor still swears they see the lights flick on inside around midnight, probably squatters. Or maybe, just maybe, ghosts waiting for someone to finally tell their story properly, not in courtroom transcripts or news blurbs, but in the cold, detailed way that reveals the truth about people like Matthew Greer. Not that they snap, but that they plan. Not that they hide, but that they wait. And when the silence gets too loud, they fill it not with apologies, but with nails. The discovery of Matthew Greer's crimes didn't end at the arrest. In many ways, that was only the surface. What came next was the slow, surgical dissection of a killer's mind. Not to humanize him, but to understand how a man could bury his family in wooden crates and sit down for breakfast 10 feet above their corpses. Within days of his arrest, psychologists from both prosecution and defense were granted access to Matthew. What they found wasn't rage or delusion. It was logic, twisted, unemotional, and disturbingly intact. He spoke of the killings not as crimes, but as resolutions. "The bills were stacking," he said. "The noise wouldn't stop. I was tired of being asked for things I didn't have." The interviews were clinical. He didn't deny a single detail, but he never expressed regret, not in the conventional sense. Instead, he said he regretted doing it messy, Forensic examiners analyzed everything: his internet history, his search patterns, even the metadata from deleted files on his work computer. It all painted a picture of quiet preparation: searches for soundproof insulation, pressure-treated wood, the weight limit of crawl spaces, the decomposition rate of sealed corpses. No single query was enough to sound alarms, but together they revealed a plan months in the making. He hadn't snapped. He had practiced. Surveillance footage showed him visiting hardware stores in different zip codes, wearing a baseball cap and sunglasses. He purchased supplies in staggered trips: a hammer here, tarp there, lime bags in cash only. The nail gun was bought second-hand, never registered. The plywood was from scrap bins behind a closed lumber yard. Nothing tied directly to the house, until it did. One of the most disturbing pieces of evidence came not from the crime scene, but from an SD card found in a drawer beneath Matthew's nightstand. On it were photos, low resolution, time-stamped. Each image showed the stages of burial: one shot of the wrapped body, one of the crate partially nailed shut, one of the final placement in the crawl space. Prosecutors presented them in court as a perverse form of inventory. The jury was visibly shaken, but it wasn't just the evidence that chilled observers. It was Matthew's demeanor. Throughout the trial, he remained still, not sedated, not panicked, just still. When the verdict was read, he blinked 3 times, adjusted his collar, and sat back. Reporters noted he looked more like a man waiting for a bus than someone facing life in solitary confinement. Inside prison, Matthew became something of an anomaly. He didn't join any groups, didn't write appeals. When asked why he did it, his answer remained consistent: they were broken. I couldn't fix them. In group therapy, he often listened, rarely spoke. When he did, it was with surgical detachment, as if describing the maintenance schedule of a fridge, not the murder of his family. Guards reported he kept to himself, always clean, always polite. But one detail stood out. He refused to sleep in his bed. Instead, he slept on the floor, flat on his back, arms crossed, as if continuing his life above the crawl space. The public reaction was swift and polarized. Some called him a monster. Others tried to chalk it up to untreated mental illness. But what disturbed most experts was the lack of diagnostic clarity. He wasn't schizophrenic. He wasn't manic. He passed all cognitive function tests. What remained was a profile disturbingly ordinary: a man who simply decided one day that his family was a burden and methodically removed them like faulty parts. The media frenzy came and went. For a few weeks, Matthew Greer was a household name. He was labeled the woodworker, the builder, the man beneath the floor. But unlike other killers, he didn't chase attention. He gave no interviews, signed no book deals. And when Netflix sent a request to include his case in a documentary on family annihilators, he declined. "No thanks," he wrote. "I'm not your villain, just another dad who ran out of answers." The statement ignited a firestorm of backlash. Victims' rights groups condemned it. Journalists tore it apart. But in that twisted sentence was a glimpse into what made Matthew so chilling. He didn't see himself as evil. He saw himself as failed, and for him, failure was justification. His house was demolished 6 months later. Local ordinances declared it unfit for residents. The crawl space was filled in with concrete. A memorial plaque now stands in the corner of the lot. 4 names, 1 blank space left uncarved. When asked why, the sculptor replied, "Because we don't say his name here." In academic circles, Matthew's case is now used in training modules for forensic psychologists. He's become the archetype of the non-delusional domestic. Executioner, not the outburst killer, but the calculated one, the one who plans dinner and dismemberment in the same breath. His file remains active in several criminology studies, but there's a quiet resistance to turning him into a case study, because the closer you look, the more uncomfortable the reflection becomes. He wasn't a monster in the woods. He was a father in a polo shirt, holding a Home Depot receipt and wondering how many nails it would take to stop the world from asking what he owed it. There are no easy answers in the wake of Matthew Greer. No mental illness to blame, no clear trauma to dissect. Just a blueprint of silence, frustration, and fatal resolve. And in that vacuum, experts warn, lies the most terrifying kind of killer. The one who isn't broken, just done. The sentencing phase of Matthew Greer's trial unfolded like a slow exorcism, not of a man, but of a myth. The myth that evil always wears a snarl, carries a weapon, or bleeds chaos. The prosecution didn't have to fight for conviction. The jury returned with a unanimous verdict after just 4 hours. Guilty on 4 counts of first-degree murder with special circumstances. The courtroom didn't erupt. There were no gasps, no tears, just a strange collective silence, like a room finally acknowledging what it always feared. The judge, known for a no-nonsense demeanor, didn't deliver a dramatic statement. Instead, he read the sentence with the cadence of a final invoice. Life in prison without parole, 4 consecutive terms. The courtroom remained still as Matthew nodded once, picked up his water, and drank. No remorse, no relief, just resolution. What came after the trial was quieter, but no less disturbing. Reporters dissected every inch of the crime scene. Analysts pored over his digital life, trying to map the psychological breadcrumbs that led to the killings. There was no manifesto, no warning post, no last meal or final confession. Just a man who built his own version of silence and called it peace. The evidence was archived. The crawlspace blueprints entered the criminal records as teaching material. The wooden crates, too large to store, were dismantled and incinerated. But the photographs, those were kept, not for spectacle, for memory. Prosecutors insisted they be preserved as a reminder of the cost of indifference, because to them, that was Matthew's most unforgivable trait, not the violence, but the stillness that surrounded it. Forensic psychologists submitted their final reports. Matthew Greer did not meet criteria for insanity, did not exhibit signs of psychosis, and did not express delusional thinking. Instead, they described him as emotionally compartmentalized, intellectually detached, and pathologically rational. One psychiatrist noted that his affect was so flat, so eerily composed, that even seasoned evaluators left the room feeling disoriented. "He's not mad," she wrote. "He's empty, and he's okay with that." Behind bars, Matthew maintained the same routines he had in suburban life. Up at 5 a.m., lights out at 10. He refused visitors, declined religious counsel, ignored all attempts from media outlets to profile him. When his sister, the only surviving relative, mailed him a letter begging for answers, he returned it unopened. No note, just his inmate number written in perfect block letters. Fellow inmates reportedly avoided him, not out of fear, but discomfort. "He never makes noise," one guard said. "You could forget he's in the cell until you pass and see him staring at the corner like he's waiting for something that never shows up." The warden, in a rare interview, confessed that Matthew Greer was unlike any killer he'd encountered. "It's like he erased his family, then erased himself. Now all that's left is the shape of a man who used to need things." Public reaction to the case flickered, then faded, but it left behind questions that don't die easily. Parents wondered if financial stress could really break someone that completely. Wives looked at their husbands a little longer. Therapists found themselves fielding new questions about emotional numbness. What does it mean when someone doesn't cry, doesn't rage, doesn't care? In quiet corners of the internet, Matthew's case became a warning. Not of abuse, not of insanity, but of collapse. Internal, slow, and deliberate. The community where the murders occurred took its own measures to heal. The elementary school planted 4 trees for the Greer children. The church held a candlelight vigil where no one spoke Matthew's name. The neighborhood association rewrote bylaws to allow for background checks on homeowners. It was symbolic, maybe futile, but it gave people something to do, something to believe would make them safer. Meanwhile, the district attorney's office began a pilot program to train law enforcement in identifying nonverbal distress signs in family dynamics. They called it the Greer Index, a checklist of behavioral red flags that don't scream but whisper. A locked basement, a withdrawn spouse, a father who suddenly stops participating in family photos. It wasn't perfect, but again, it was something. Matthew Greer's story did not become a bestseller. No Hollywood studio picked up the rights. There was no documentary series, no podcast countdown. His crimes were too quiet, too mundane, too real. He killed without flair, without ego. And in doing so, he left behind a void more terrifying than blood, the possibility that the worst among us might not be the loudest, but the most invisible. Years later, criminology students still study his file, still argue over what made him snap, but the chilling conclusion remains. Maybe he didn't snap at all. Maybe he just made a decision and followed it through with the precision of a man building a deck. One board at a time, one nail at a time, until the noise above finally stopped. And maybe, in that silence, he found exactly what he wanted. Not freedom, not peace, just nothing. Evil doesn't always scream. Sometimes it walks barefoot across the hallway carpet, closes the door gently, and waits for the rest of the house to fall asleep. That's the pattern that ties each of these 5 stories together. Not just the violence, not just the blood, but the silence that came before it. These weren't crimes committed in a blaze of rage or by strangers in the night. These were orchestrated moments of stillness, premeditated, clean, methodical, carried out by the one person the victims trusted the most, family. And that's what makes them so difficult to forget. Because every family has cracks. Every household has its quiet arguments, its financial pressures, its unseen emotional bruises. But what separates the homes we live in from the crime scenes we fear is the willingness to
pretend nothing's wrong. KTT.
Each of these men lived double lives, not in the theatrical spy movie sense, but in the invisible, deadly way that only comes from rot beneath the floorboards. Behind the cookouts, the PTA meetings, the 9-to-5 routines, they were erasing humanity one decision at a time. A drink left untouched, a hug never returned, a door that started staying locked. The warning signs weren't missing, they were muffled. And in that silence, horror found room to breathe. The family cleaver carved his comfort into routine, a man who smiled at neighbors before slaughtering his kin like livestock, as if he were pruning a garden. Then came the planner, the one who built a lie so elaborate it collapsed on top of him. His crimes weren't violent in appearance, but they were just as brutal. Slow poisoning through isolation, deception, and a calculated unraveling of those who loved him. Killer 3 kept a family locked in the grip of obedience, training them to see silence as safety until he snapped and turned the very walls into a tomb. Killer 4. He turned manipulation into currency. Every word, every gesture, every kind act was a transaction, and when his wife and kids stopped paying attention, he cashed in their lives like overdue debts. Then there was Matthew Greer, the architect of stillness, who didn't raise his voice, didn't break a dish, didn't throw a punch. He simply withdrew until the absence of sound became a scream loud enough to drown out 4 innocent lives. Together, these 5 men didn't just kill, they erased. They erased futures, erased laughter, erased the right to memory, but in doing so, they left behind echoes, ones that investigators still hear years later when they walk into perfectly made beds, untouched school backpacks, and half-finished cereal boxes at crime scenes. These killers challenge everything we want to believe about safety, about love, about the human face of danger. We teach children to fear strangers. We install cameras on doorbells. We check the locks twice before bed. But what happens when the threat lives inside? When the killer remembers your birthday, signs your permission slip, and kisses you goodnight before ending your life? The justice system caught them all, eventually. But punishment isn't prevention, and trials don't resurrect the dead. What's left in the aftermath are questions no verdict can answer. How long did they plan it? What did the last breakfast taste like? Did the victims know, in those final seconds, that they were dying at the hands of someone who once held their hand in a hospital room? Some say evil announces itself, that it can be seen in eyes, in language, in temper. But these 5 cases suggest something worse, that evil can be patient, that it can mimic love, that it can rehearse normalcy until even its closest witnesses forget how to recognize it. That's why stories like these matter, not because they entertain, not because they shock, but because they force us to look beyond the surface, to listen harder when the house goes quiet. The truth is, there's no single profile for a family annihilator. They don't all come from broken homes. They aren't all visibly unstable. Some are charming. Others are cold, but what they share is an ability to compartmentalize, to bury rage beneath politeness, to treat murder not as an act of fury, but as a solution to an emotional equation. It's this emotional math, this internal calculation of them or me, that makes them so dangerous. Because once someone sees the people closest to them as obstacles, not relationships, there's no empathy left to hold them back. And once they decide to act, the rest is just logistics. What time do they go to bed? Where are the cameras? How long until the neighbors hear something? That's the real terror. Not that they kill, but how calmly they prepare, how easily they execute, and how often no one notices until the bodies cool. These cases will stay in case files, in forensic textbooks, in late-night YouTube playlists. They'll be told in documentaries, dramatized in series, and studied by students who think they've seen the worst of humanity. But the people who will never forget them, the detectives who stepped into those homes, the jurors who saw the evidence, and the families, the cousins, the grandparents, the friends, left with empty chairs at dinner, unanswered birthday calls, and framed school portraits of children who never grew up. Those are the people who understand that evil isn't a scream in the night. It's a whisper in the living room, a forgotten appointment, a missed "I love you." And for the rest of us watching from behind the screen, we're left with just one final question. When was the last time we truly knew someone?